Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Broom Closet Briefing podcast. And this is episode number 9, and I am recording it on 22nd of May 2026. I'm your host, Broom, and welcome back to another episode where we look at the headlines, the symbolism under the headlines, and the power moves under the symbolism, and the collective nervous breakdown hiding behind the phrase, which is consumer confidence. So, today I want to actually mostly focus on the economy. I know we are all worried about it, and I keep getting this question in my chat that, Broom, are we going to see a Great Depression, or are we going to see like totally economic crash? And I know I have already published an article on this, which I am going to link to this podcast episode. Please go look at it. It's called the Matchstick Economy. But I thought that reading, since it's in the form of a newsletter, I think I wanted to add some more analysis of mine, which would have made it like incredibly long. So that's why I am recording this podcast episode so that you have a little bit more context on what I actually implied in that reading. So that reading will be attached to this podcast episode in the show notes, but I still want to talk a little bit on it. So, we need to talk about the economy, not in the boring cable news way, where three men in quarter zips stare at the chart and pretend the Dow Jones is the national mood ring of the working class. So, we are talking about the economy as a lived environment, like you and I, and the economy kind of like as a weather, as a pressure system, and as the thing that decides whether people feel safe or they feel lied to, or whether they feel like the country is functioning, and whether they decide to take that frustration into the voting booth with the emotional energy of someone returning a cursed appliance to a customer service. So, this episode is based on a set of recent economy readings that I did, but I'm not going to walk through the cards here. What I want to point out in this episode is the broader pattern the readings opened up. So, tarot, when used properly, is not just a spooky vending machine where you just insert anxiety and receive a vague sentence about new beginnings. Please, you know I don't do that. So, we are adults with internet trauma and utility bills. Tarot is basically an archetypal tool. It lets us look at the emotional architecture of a moment and shows the pattern beneath the event. It does not replace the economic data, historical analysis, or the political reporting or common sense per se. It sits beside them like kind of like a witchy x-ray machine and says that, darling, the bone is broken right here, right? And what the readings basically showed is not the immediate apocalypse. And I want to say that clearly because the internet loves this collapse porn like it's a subscription box. And this does not look like the country wakes up tomorrow and suddenly we are all bartering beans in a parking lot while someone named Kyle will declare himself the Duke of Costco or something. And that is not the pattern. The pattern is slower, more corrosive, and honestly, more politically dangerous. So this looks like a matchstick, kind of like a what do you call it? Like a powder cake, right? It's kind of an economy that has already kind of exploded, and it's an economy sitting in a room full of like dry wood, old receipts, maybe leaking gas from somewhere, and very confident people playing with lighters while saying, relax, we have this under control. Like, have you heard that before? Yes, by our GOP members. And it's not just fragility, it's the fragility plus the arrogance, right? Fragility plus the denial. And it's also fragility plus, I want to say, institutions kind of performing stability while you and I, ordinary people, can literally feel the floorboards kind of warming under our feet. And that is where we are. I want to say the central pattern is this. The danger is not only what happens in the oil market or in the shipping lanes or in the interest rates, even in the grocery prices or the global conflict. The danger is the emotional economy that forms around those things. Modern economies are not just material systems. They are kind of like a psychological system, and they run on confidence, expectations, sometimes on liquidity, credit, supply chains, labor behavior, consumer habits, and people's willingness to believe tomorrow will look enough like today to keep participating normally. And once that belief starts cracking, everything kind of changes. So people do not need an really declared official recession to behave as though they are under economic threat. They only need to feel it. They need to see gas prices rising. They need to notice that the grocery receipt looks like it was written by some ransom negotiator. And they need to hear that shipping routes might be disrupted, that oil markets are nervous, and that airlines are adjusting their fuel surcharges. And also that companies are monitoring conditions, which is corporate language for we are absolutely going to make this your problem. And then people begin adapting before the data kind of catches up. So, this is why history keeps showing us that nations do not usually enter economic crisis through one dramatic doorway. They drift into it, a thousand small adjustments. A family kind of cancels a trip. A worker will stop eating lunch out. A small business would delay hiring. And then a retailer will raise the prices preemptively. A corporation can use global instability as cover to protect margins. And a government insisting everything is manageable, the public does the math and the gas pump and quietly decides the government is lying. So, that gap between official reassurance and lived experience is where legitimacy starts to kind of shake and then eventually rot. And when I say legitimacy, I do not mean some abstract political science word trapped in a graduate seminar wearing tweed and depression. I mean the basic question every society has to answer every day. Do people really believe the system is protecting them, or do they believe the system is feeding on them? That question is a whole damn episode. So, historically, when nations hit this kind of pressure point, the initial shock is often material, but the long term consequence is political. Well, the 1970s oil shocks are the obvious comparison, and yes, we have to talk about them because every time oil becomes the monster under the bed, history starts clearing its throat. In the 1970s, energy instability did not just make gasoline more expensive. It actually helped to reorder the public's relationship to government, inflation, labor, foreign policy, and everyday life. So people sat in gas lines, they watched their prices rise, and they felt that post war promise of endless growth had cracked. The oil shock did not create every problem of the decade by itself, but it expressed vulnerabilities, or it exposed the vulnerabilities per se that were already there. So that's the key, a shock that reveals the structure, right? So strong system absorbs the stress and then it adjusts, but a brittle system will turn the stress into revolution. Suddenly people will see what they were not supposed to see. They see dependency, they see how far food travels before it reaches a shelf, and then see how quickly transportation costs become your grocery costs. So they see how much of modern life is built on the assumption that fuel will remain available, affordable, and also boring. They see how quickly leaders will move from everything is fine to temporary disruption to patriotic sacrifice to please do not look at our donors' profit margins. So the 1970s also gave us policy responses that are worth remembering because nations do not just suffer through these moments. So they try things. right? Some things would work, some things would backfire so spectacularly that they should be preserved in a museum labeled Men with Charts made this even worse. So governments used price controls, rationing systems, conservation campaigns, strategic reserves, diplomatic pressure, monetary tightening, subsidies, and industrial policy. So some of these tools can soften a blow. Then strategic reserves can buy time. Diplomacy can cool the market for a little bit, and then conservation can reduce the demand. But public investment can reduce future vulnerability. But then price controls, when badly designed, can create the shortages or distortions. So subsidies can become a political morphine, numbing pain without treating the wound, kind of a way. So monetary tightening can crush the inflation, but also crush the workers, housing, and small businesses in that process. Because apparently the economy is always a trolley problem, and somehow the working class keeps getting tied to the tracks. So the lesson from those episodes is not that one tool will solve everything. The lesson is that crisis management has to match the actual crisis. If the crisis is partly energy supply, partly inflation psychology, partly corporate opportunism, partly geopolitical instability, and partly public distrust, then pretending it is only one thing is a malpractice in a suit. And that is where the United States is especially vulnerable right now, because Americans are already exhausted. The public is not entering the possible energy squeeze fresh, rested, and full of institutional trust anymore. Absolutely not. The public is kind of entering this like a woman walking into a meeting after 3 hours of sleep, two school emails, a surprise medical bill, and a grocery total that made her consider learning homesteading from a TikTok teenager named Sage. So people have been through inflation, housing stress, healthcare stress, debt stress, job instability, political chaos, pandemic aftershocks, climate disasters, and an endless media environment that turns every event into a screaming contest between panic and denial. So, when another shock would arrive, people do not process it neutrally. They process it through accumulated exhaustion. This is one of the biggest things the readings pointed to: accumulated pressure. Not one event, but the public realization that everything feels way too expensive and unstable, manipulated, and very poorly explained and managed. So, that is a kind of atmosphere where an oil price spike becomes more than an oil price spike. It becomes kind of like a symbol. Gas becomes a symbol, groceries become a symbol, utility bills will become a symbol, your rent will become a symbol. Every checkout lane becomes a tiny referendum on national competence. And this is where we need to bring in another historical pattern. Economic pain becomes politically explosive when people believe the pain is unfairly distributed. People can endure hardship when they believe the sacrifice is shared, the leadership is honest, and the outcome has some kind of purpose. But when ordinary people are asked to tighten belts while corporations post profits, executive cash bonuses, politicians perform concern, and wealthy people experience crisis as a lifestyle inconvenience, resentment will become volcanic. That is not ideology. That is just human nature. If the ship is sinking and everyone is like kind of bailing water, people may cooperate. If the ship is sinking and the first class is sipping champagne while steerage is told to be more resilient, congratulations, you have invented a revolution starter kit. So we have seen versions of this repeatedly. The French Revolution was not just about bread prices, but bread prices mattered because they became the daily proof of a rotten order. The Arab Spring was not just about food prices or unemployment or corruption and repression separately. It was about a population feeling cornered by a system that could no longer justify itself. Same with the Great Depression. It did not just produce economic suffering, it transformed political expectations around what government owned citizens. The 2008 financial crisis did not just destroy wealth, it destroyed trust, especially when the public watched banks get rescued while homeowners drowned. That legitimacy wound never fully healed. It just got covered with cheaper credit, gig work, steaming subscriptions, and wives. And now here we are again with another potential squeeze forming at the intersection of geopolitics, oil anxiety, inflation fatigue, and then institutional distrust and political volatility. It is not the same as those earlier moments, though. History never repeats itself like a photocopier called a Xerox machine. It repeats like a drunk theater troupe. Same themes, but different costumes. Maybe worse lighting. So the United States in 2026 is not Weimar Germany, not 1970s Britain, not 2008, not the 1930s, not the Arab Spring, but the archetypal pattern is familiar, right? A strained public, visible inequality, confusing elite messaging, rising costs, and a sense that the people in charge are managing perception more aggressively than they are managing reality. So that's a danger zone. Because once people believe they're being managed instead of informed, every official statement starts sounding like a propaganda, even when parts of it are probably going to be true. This is a curse of a broken trust. A government can say things like, we are taking steps to stabilize markets, and the public would hear this. We are hiding the bad part. And a corporation can say things like prices reflect increased input costs or something like that. And the public would hear, we found another excuse to rob you with fluorescent lighting. So media panel can say consumers remain resilient, and the public would hear, nobody on this panel has bought eggs recently without using a company card. So the emotional economy would turn defensive. And when consumers turn defensive, the economy would change its shape. People would delay their purchases, they prioritize necessities, they may bulk buy. We saw all of that during COVID, right? They stockpile a little and they reduce a lot of the discretionary spending. So they become more sensitive to prices and they stop trusting that tomorrow will be cheaper, and they can create a feedback loop because fear would change their behavior and behavior would change their market can create new headlines and new headlines would deepen fear. So it's kind of like a feedback loop. This is why economic psychology matters. Markets are not cold machines. They are haunted houses full of algorithms, anxiety, leverage, and men pretending they are rational because they own fleece vests. So now the readings did not suggest like a total free fall, like I said before. That is important. Let's keep that in mind. They showed mitigation, intervention as well. So attempts to kind of rebalance the balance. Adults may enter the room, or at least adult shaped figures with enough survival instinct to understand that an uncontrolled energy shock would be politically catastrophic. And that matters because historically, states do respond to these moments. They do not just stand there watching the stove catch fire, although sometimes they do take an impressive amount of time to stop explaining that fire is a market signal. What could be done? Several things, and most of them are deeply unsexy, which means they are probably real things that can be done. First and foremost, diplomatic de escalation. If instability is tied to conflict risk, shipping route anxiety, or oil transit vulnerability, then claiming the geopolitical environment matters. Markets calming the geopolitical environment matters. Markets would respond not only to actual disruption, but to perceived probability of disruption. A credible diplomatic off ramp can also lower the temperature before the material shock will deepen further. Second thing we can do, strategic supply management. This can include releases from reserves, coordination with allies, we have heard that one before, rerouting supply chains, and emergency planning around shipping and fuel. These actions do not solve dependency, but they buy time. And in a crisis, time is kind of like oxygen. Third thing we can do, targeted relief rather than broad, sloppy stimulus. And if energy prices do spike, households at the lower and middle end would feel it first and the hardest. So, targeted support can prevent economic pressure from becoming like social panic, but broad money spraying can worsen this inflation if supply remains constrained. So, this is where the policy has to be more surgical, not theatrical. But unfortunately, like theatrical policy is the thing about these people, because most of these people in his cabinet are from a reality TV show. I would say they're more of the TV show part, less of the reality part. But I digress. Fourth is anti profiteering enforcement, which will never happen. This is the part nobody wants to say loudly enough, because corporate America would start clutching its pearl like a Victorian widow. So, whenever anyone suggests maybe crisis should not be treated as like a premium pricing opportunity, but if companies use geopolitical instability as cover to expand margins, then the legitimacy damage will become like really, really big. So, people are not stupid, they know when they are being squeezed. Fifth, demand reduction and conservation. This sounds old fashioned because it is, but old fashioned does not mean useless. I would say during energy stress, reducing demand can be powerful. So the problem is that conservation campaigns only work politically if people believe sacrifice is shared. You cannot ask ordinary families to drive less while private jets are doing the aerial cartwheels, right? That is how you turn a public policy into a meme with teeth. Six, long-term resilience. So energy diversification, I think I've talked about it many times, like public transit, domestic manufacturing capacity, local food system, grid modernization, and less dependence on fragile global choke points. That means green energy revolution. So these are the boring structural answers that prevent the same crisis from returning every few years, wearing like a different hat. But because they require planning beyond the next election cycle, they are treated as a radical witchcraft by a political system addicted to quarterly optics. And we know that. This is where tarot as an archetypal tool is especially useful, not because tarot gives us the spreadsheet, but it does not. But tarot gives us a symbolic pattern. That's what I use in my Substack articles, and I show you the pattern underneath. It operates through emotion, myth, fear, desire, resentment, identity, and story. A nation does not respond to inflation only as a number. It responds to inflation as a betrayal, as humiliation, as loss of control. And right now, the theme that matters most is the connection between economic pressure and the electoral behavior, because the reading strongly pointed towards the economy becoming politically more catalytic. Again, not collapse, catalysis, a chemical reaction, a shift in state. So, economic frustration mutating into civic action, and people who previously ignored, checked out from the foreign policy, didn't care to vote in the last election because they couldn't care less. They suddenly started caring because foreign policy is now in their gas tank. People who turned out political corruption suddenly caring because corruption is now on their grocery receipt. So people who thought democracy discourse was, oh no, I'm really not into politics, or I just don't want to participate in politics, and they, all of this abstract discourse, like suddenly realizing that governance quality determines whether their household survives the month with dignity. So this is how economic shocks will become legitimacy shocks. And that brings us to the election environment. The broader political readings around this same period showed a public that is A, exhausted, B, emotionally activated, and increasingly intolerant of manipulation and overreach. The economy reading fits into that same architecture. It is not separate. It is the material pressure that makes this political pressure harder to contain. And I don't think that his regime is helping themselves. Anyways, if people already feel that institutions are lying to them, and then the economy gets more expensive, and then leaders ask for, please be patient, and then corporations report profits, and then media outlets try to massage the story into something more palatable, the public mood can shift very, very quickly. Not necessarily into one neat ideological direction. Please do not have fairy tale in your head that this is what's going to happen, but into more volatility, into backlash, into turnout, into rejection of whoever is perceived as presiding over this kind of an economic squeeze. So here is uncomfortable historical truth. Governments often underestimate this stage because the system still appears functional, and I'm doing the air quotes thing. Stores are still open. You probably still have a job if you do. Planes are still flying. Sometimes they're falling off of the sky, right? People still go to brunch on Sundays and probably get eggs anywhere, any time of the day. The apocalypse has not arrived. In the one that is talking about the show that is very, very popular right now, like a dystopian apocalyptic one, is Fallout, I think. Anyways, so elites assume the public is just fine. But people can continue routines while emotionally withdrawing consent. They can go to work and still decide the system is totally legitimate. They can buy groceries and still rage at the receipt. They can, scroll headlines and quietly conclude that everyone in charge is either lying, incompetent, or owned by big corporations. That is the danger of everything is still functioning illusion. A society does not have to collapse for its politics to become explosive. It only has to feel like the bargain has broken completely. So the American bargain has always been messy, unequal, kind of mythologized, and frankly, full of unpaid invoices. But the modern version was something like this: you can work hard, consume, stay distracted, trust that the system will remain broadly stable, and maybe your children will have a shot at something better if the economy behaves and nobody in power lights the map on fire. That bargain has been weakening for years. Housing broke it in some way or the other for many people. Healthcare completely shattered it for others. Student debt has completely dismantled it. Inflation broke it. Climate disasters broke it. Political extremism broke it. Now, an energy shock or oil panic would just take a sledgehammer and completely destroy it. It would walk into a room where the crisis is already kind of sitting in the couch, right? Waiting for you. That is why this moment feels so combustible. Where are we headed? Based on the broader pattern, we are headed into a period where economic anxiety becomes more and more visible, more and more political, and more emotionally contagious. So I would expect more public sensitivity around gas prices, food prices, utility costs, shipping disruptions, airline prices, and corporate pricing behavior. So I would expect officials to work very, very hard behind the scenes to prevent the true rupture because they know the political consequences would be extremely brutal. I would expect the media environment to become more contradictory, with some voices insisting everything is manageable and others screaming collapse for clicks because apparently nuance died in a shallow grave behind a sponsored newsletter. So I would expect consumers to become more defensive, less carefree spending, more practical purchasing, more bulk buying. Please don't buy toilet paper though, like that, like we did in COVID. More local resilience talk, maybe. So more people asking whether they should have extra supplies, extra savings, fewer subscriptions, less debt exposure, not full bunker mode, more like I'm not panicking, but I'm absolutely buying the larger bag of rice, kind of. Plus, but please don't hoard the toilet paper like we did. Anyways, I would expect also class resentment to intensify becoming because economic strain is never distributed evenly. So the people with assets will protect themselves and the people without assets will absorb the volatility through debt, stress, maybe delayed care, second jobs, etc. And that split screen reality will become harder to hide. And politically that would matter a lot. Most importantly, I would expect economic pressure to kind of feed directly into the broader electoral mood. People would vote on identity, yes, but they vote on rights, democracy, fear, resentment, belonging, and narrative. But when affordability becomes the main theme, it becomes a table underneath every other issue. A voter may care about 10 different things, border, immigration, blah, blah, blah. But if the cost of living becomes unbearable, everything gets filtered through that survival mode. The question will become who made my life harder and who lied about it and who looks capable of stopping this bleeding. That is where we are headed. Not necessarily into collapse, but into consequences. And honestly, consequence is the word for this entire era. Consequence for brittle supply chains, energy dependence, the corporate greed, for political leaders who thought performance could replace their competence. The entire GOP is a huge example of that. So, consequence for an economy that told people they were resilient when that meant was you have been abundant, but you are still making payments. Because once people see the fragility, they do not unsee it. Once they realize that grocery prices, oil markets, foreign conflict are creeping into their day to day life, the political legitimacy is connected to that. The old separation would collapse where that they can afford to check out from the political consequences. Their foreign policy will become domestic policy. Energy policy will become their family policy. Right? Even inflation can become their democracy, no, like a democracy policy. So corporate accountability will become their kitchen table kind of policy. Everything is connected. The only difference is that crisis will removes the curtain. So no, I do not think this is the end of American economy. I think I got that question so many times. That is way too simplistic, too cinematic, and kind of lazy. The more likely path is a grinding squeeze, followed by intervention, followed by political fallout. But the machine keeps churning, but louder, more visibly strained. More people will notice the smoke, more people will stop trusting the operators, but more people begin asking whether the people in charge are actually steering the ship or just kind of like rearranging the deck chairs. And that is where the political shock comes in, right? Economic pressure does not stay economic, it becomes kind of like a moral, emotional, and electoral. So people may not know the exact policy mechanism that raised their costs, but they know how it feels to be squeezed. They know how it feels to be told things are fine by people who are clearly not shopping at the same grocery store. So they know how it feels when the official story and the live story diverge so sharply that the official story starts sounding like a hostage note, or maybe it's more like let them eat cake story. That is the broader pattern. So this economy does not require everything to kind of burn down. It only requires enough people to realize someone has been playing with fire in a room they are trapped inside. And once that realization would spread, the politics of the country would change. So watch the gas prices, the grocery bill, shipping headlines, um, whether media starts laundering panic into normalcy, the consumer behavior, and whether people begin making smaller, quieter, or more defensive choices. And then watch the ballot box, because the ballot box is where economic dread eventually goes to file a complaint. And as always, the story is never just a story, the price is never just a price, the shock is never just a shock. The economy is literally talking. The question is whether the people in charge are listening before the match hits the floor. I hope this illuminates all the questions, or at least answers all the questions that you guys had about the economy. I think everything needs a catalyst to move towards the correct direction. Although this is a really, really consequential catalyst, in my opinion, about having this economy going through this kind of a downturn, but I do think this is the right catalyst for the nation to actually pay attention that A, democracy is not a given, and B, our civic duty is to not be checked out from politics. Because no matter what happens, if you are not into politics, politics is very much into your life. And it's high time we all start paying a little bit more attention to what is going on, and I would say the consequences of our little silly actions that we keep taking, which includes voting and not voting when it's time to vote. All right. And I will see you guys in the next episode. And till then, please take very good care of yourself. Next episode, I'll be back with something um, interesting to unpack. And I will link all the articles that I referenced in this particular episode. Please go check them out. I also have a private Patreon where I teach my tarot, my method on how I read them. And come check out that Patreon if you are interested in learning tarot and using tarot as a tool to divine the political future or your own future for that matter. My Substack is called the Broom Closet Briefing, and it is a paid newsletter for the majority of it because of the nature of the predictions that I make and the fact that they're extremely accurate, sometimes to a T. So it is worth your time if you want to become a subscriber to my Substack. I also have the Broom Closet Dispatch, which rolls up the news, separating from the noise of the headlines, which also maps out the pattern and the consequential aspect of the news headlines, because not every story is just a story, random story. I don't think anything happens as coincidence, but if they're happening on the same time, they have a dots to connect, and I do that for you and only bring up things that you absolutely need to pay attention to, not the ones that are happening and it's just for distraction, kind of like the ballroom, right? So the Broom Closet Dispatch is absolutely reader supported, completely free newsletter that actually rolls up the news headlines of the current time. The Broom Closet Briefing, my flagship publication, makes predictions on the upcoming events I'm doing right now since it's election year. So a lot of my predictions are based on the election results that I am predicting, and I've been quite 100% accurate in predicting the election consequences so far. So check those out and hopefully subscribe and support independent media or creator or whoever you think I am. If I fit in the category of an independent journalist, I don't think I call myself journalist in that sense, because it is a very liminal space of between divination journalism and the broader pattern mapping. So support creators. If you like my work, please consider becoming a free or a paid subscriber. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. Till then, take very good care of yourself. Thank you.